Ancient Egypt is nothing like the mainstream claims. The amount of problems that we find when we start to study this area of history objectively becomes legion. Unfortunately, we live in a time to where propaganda is now valued over actual archaeological and scientific evidence. I've been in a Fomenko mood for the past couple of weeks, so you know what? You guys get to suffer because of that. So we're going to read another section from one of Anatoly Fomenko's chronology books, and this area is going to talk more about the chronology of ancient Egypt, and it deals with some subject matter that is not exactly ever admitted to by mainstream Egyptologists. So let's get into it. Who destroyed the names of people and countries written on the ancient Egyptian monuments? When was it done? And for what purpose? And so, we are told that the names of the pharaohs, as well as certain cities and countries found on many Egyptian monuments, were chiseled off by someone and even replaced in some cases. Egyptologists blame this on the quote-unquote ancient pharaohs. This is, for instance, what the Egyptologist Bruch tells us about it. Quote, "When the kings of the 18th dynasty ascended to the throne, they started to destroy the monuments of the Hyksos dynasty, chiseling off their names and titles and replacing them with their own names and titles, giving birth to a complete travesty of historical truth." Unquote. But is this true that the pharaohs are to blame? It goes without saying that a new regnant dynasty could destroy the monuments built by their predecessors for certain political reasons. However, the replacement of names with actual monuments left intact strikes us as thoroughly outlandish. For instance, the statue of F.E. Dzerzhinsky was removed from a square in Moscow in 1991. Yet nobody came up with the preposterous idea of leaving the statue in its place and replacing the name of Dzerzhinsky by some other name. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, how often do you ever see in modern times somebody take a pre-existing statue, something that is obviously, a very particular thing, and then completely rechristen it as something else? It would be like, Obama walking up to a statue of George Bush and then chiseling his name, in place of Bush's name. Right? Nobody's doing that. Nobody is constantly changing names on monuments whenever somebody else takes over. And the reason why is simple. You actually risk damaging the socio-psychological factor within the general populace. Now, on the surface, you might think that doesn't matter, right? If you're an emperor and you rule with an iron fist, who cares what the masses think, right? They don't matter. You can make them think whenever they want, or screw them. Like, who cares what they believe? As long as you're in charge, it doesn't matter. But rulership is not quite that simple, right? There is a reason why we look around today and there isn't a single ruling country right now, or I should say a ruling regime, or whatever you want to call it, that just runs around and absolutely uses the worst possible violence you can imagine to subjugate their population. Like, they're not running around shooting people left and right every single day. Corpses are not constantly mounting up. Even though there are areas which might seem bad, there's no ruling class that is employing that level of hardcore violence to keep the population subjugated. And the reason why is simple. You have to have somebody to rule over if you are going to be a ruler. Right? You need a slave class, essentially. If you're constantly damaging and destroying your slave class, how useful is that slave class really? This is one of the aspects of power that very few people think about. You actually do have to treat your population with a certain level of decency Otherwise, nobody's going to be able to do anything. You can't run around and cut off everybody's arms just because you feel like it, just because you're in power, because if you were to do that, your entire rulership would fall apart. You don't have the slave power. So nobody goes to that extreme. One of the other things that you don't really see people do is you do not see people change the names on statues, and it's for the same basic reason. If you were to run around, let's say you're in charge, and you decide to change the name on all the statues of the previous ruler to your name, what sense is that going to make from actually multiple angles? The first part is that everybody's going to look at you and they're going to have an even lower opinion of you as a leader than they might have already had. Right? So you already don't really want to deal with that in the first place. The second thing is that you don't really want to put your name on a likeness of somebody that isn't you. So from a ruling perspective, I don't want somebody else getting credit for my rulership, right? I'm not going to go put my name on somebody else's statue. That's stupid. Why would I do that? That does nothing for my ego. So when we look at ancient Egypt and we see Egyptologists describing how all of this history was changed around, how all of these pharaohs supposedly went, destroyed all these names, chiseled out other names, added their names, etc., etc., it starts to get a little weird. Now on the surface, this sounds very basic and it makes sense, right? Oh, it makes sense that you would want to erase the rulers that came before you. And I don't disagree. There is some truth to that. That could have taken place. However, the way it takes place in general, especially in Egypt, things look very weird. Anyway, let's keep going with Fomenko and we'll see what he says. Moreover, we shall see that the destructions of names in Egypt was strangely selective. For instance, on the famous Karnak inscription, one sees a long list of cities conquered by Thutmose III. Certain city names, however, were chiseled off by someone in a number of places. We shall see that these names were very interesting indeed. What was wrong with them, and who is responsible for their destruction? We shall voice our hypothetical explanation below. For the meantime, let us quote the words of N.A. Morozov, who also noticed this odd and significant fact. Quote, The inscriptions have contained names pertaining to epochs considered too recent by the advocates of Egypt's great antiquity. And some ultra-Orthodox traveler may have chiseled them off so as they wouldn't tempt anyone in the epochs when the interpretation of hieroglyphs wasn't forgotten yet, or after 1822, right after Champollion's reconstruction, when it was problematic for the Europeans to travel to Egypt and to verify the information collected there critically. Unquote. Morozov proceeds as follows. Quote, I wouldn't have dared voice this consideration if it hadn't been for a long memory of a certain Russian traveler's report dating from the first half of the 19th century. I was completely flabbergasted and remember this passage until this very day. To the best of my recollection, it comes from Basil's book entitled A Russian Sailor's Voyage to Egypt, Syria, and the Greek Archipelago, published in the 1840s. The author says that when he visited the sepulchres and the buildings described by Champollion with a feeling of an almost religious piety, he discovered that numerous drawings reproduced in Champollion's works had vanished without a trace. He asked his Arab guide about the identity of the parties responsible for this barbarity. The guide told him that the drawings were chiseled off by Champollion himself. The sailor was amazed and inquired why Champollion needed to do it. The Arab, who had still remembered Champollion, answered laconically, so that his books would remain the only document available to later researchers to make them irreplaceable. Morozov sums up as follows. The research of the names chiseled off the walls of the Egyptian monuments and their subsequent replacement inevitably lead us to the assumption that we are confronted by a deliberate mystification, which is likely to have been made by the first person to publish these inscriptions, especially given that the publication took place in the first half of the 19th century. We also have explicit evidence of eyewitnesses that virtually caught Champollion red-handed. This is what Peter Elberat tells us in the Revisit of Egypt by the architect Gossamer. Quote, I had the ill fortune of coming to Thebes right after Champollion. This dire news, considering the state of affairs in the autumn of 1829, was brought by the Darmstadt architect Fritz Mark Gossamer to his patron George August Kussner, diplomat, collector, and founder of the German Archaeological Institute in Rome. What did the glorified Champollion do? So, damn, this is interesting. I didn't know this. I didn't realize that Champollion himself had been caught destroying evidence in Egypt. Like, what the Alright, let's go on. Gessmer told Kessner the following. I respect the scientific authority of Champollion in every which way, but I must say that as a person, he demonstrates a temper that might greatly harm his reputation. The Theban sepulchre found by Belzoni was one of the best. At least it was completely intact without any signs of damage. And now, because of Champollion, the best objects that it had contained are destroyed. Beautiful, life-sized artwork lies shattered on the ground. Anyone who had seen this sepulchre before will not be able to recognize it now. I was completely infuriated when I witnessed this sacrilege. Unquote. Yeah, that whole thing was a quote, by the way. Like one long quote of a quote. Yeah. That's crazy. I didn't realize that people were already accusing of Champollion of destroying all kinds of evidence. We actually need to look into this guy, because now I'm wondering if he might be connected with other kinds of groups. I wonder. So, one of the reasons why this kind of stuff is important to acknowledge with respect to supposed ancient Egypt is because Egypt really does show us two completely different kinds of societies that existed there. Right? We have a situation to where you have amazing megalithic structures. You know, the pyramids, Assyrian, etc. You have all of these unbelievable structures. Then you seem to have another civilization which comes later, and the best these guys are able to do is they can do some stonework, yes, but they seem to write in pictographs, right? They come way later, and they're only able to write in a language with, pictures. That's it. A pictograph language is not really ever going to be thought of as a high-level language, at least in the way the Egyptians did it. I mean, look at hieroglyphics, for example. I know you can kind of make you can kind of make an argument to say that pictographic language can translate into higher forms of communication. You could make that argument, but for the hieroglyphic situation, I mean, right now, supposedly we can translate all of this stuff. And Champollion, but for the hieroglyphic situation, right now, okay. However, for the hieroglyphic situation in Egypt, that does not seem to be the case. It's funny, right now we kind of believe that we have the hieroglyphics translated, and Champollion is the guy who did that, actually. But here's the question. How do we know that translation is accurate? Because that Rosetta Stone, well, there's all kinds of problems with that Rosetta Stone. We actually have zero evidence that proves that the Rosetta Stone itself is something that would or could be used as a translation device. A lot of people don't ever mention this, but we have no evidence that that is what the Rosetta Stone is implying. There is nothing on the Rosetta Stone that says, yes, here is the ultimate translation between these three languages. Have fun. That doesn't exist. That is actually a supposition made by Champollion, and it's been carried on from that point, because it has appeared to allow us to read the hieroglyphs. Now, that's a whole other show in and of itself, but anyways, it is interesting that Champollion is over here destroying stuff. Yeah, it really does make me wonder if he has any connections, possibly, to maybe any secret societies or mystery schools. Okay, let's keep going. The naive Gesamir failed to realize what Champollion was actually doing. He made the simple-minded assumption, or alternatively, received this information from a third party, that Champollion was driven by the vain desire to take the artwork away to France, hammering away at the ancient walls. Presumably, 2 fragments of artwork were destroyed so as the third could be removed. However, it had proved impossible to cut the stone, so everything perished as a result. This explanation could be valid theoretically. However, given all we know, it is hard to chase away the thought that Champollion's motivation was completely different. And I agree. That dude knew exactly what he was doing, and it was not going to be for anybody's benefit, at least not for the general sciences. Yeah, I'm willing to bet that. According to some other evidence, when Champollion visited the Italian archive in Turin in 1824, he reportedly demonstrated a thoroughly different attitude towards the quote-unquote ancient Egyptian papyri. J. Possener, a French scientist, wrote the following about Champollion's research of the Egyptian document in the Turin in 1824. Quote, Champollion deals with numerous papyri, copying passages from the texts they contain, in particular the dates and the names of rulers. Champollion has commenced his study of papyri fragments, treating them with utmost care. Unquote. Could the above be explained by the fact that there was no more pressing urgency to correct the ancient history? After all, we realize that in Europe this editing work had already been conducted by some of Champollion's predecessors. It's crazy, you know, right now, even the alternative mainstream generally believes the mainstream chronology with respect to ancient Egypt. The funny part about it is that if you go and you study just some of this stuff, I mean, this is like the basic beginning Egyptology. We find all kinds of problems that are immediately raised when we see how the beginnings of Egyptology start. I mean, right here, we already have Champollion possibly destroying evidence. Like right there. I mean, people are willing to admit this, and I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it at all. And I'll even take it further and say, of course, there were probably other people doing the exact same thing. You know, to make matter worse, they're already talking about the papyri here. There's no such thing as a papyri from, say, 5,000 years ago. That does not exist. There's no 2,000-year-old papyrus scripts out there to where people can read them and date all of this stuff. None of that exists. So the papyri that Champollion would have been studying at this point in time, it really does beg the question, how old is that stuff for real? You know, the reality is the papyri he is studying is probably, maybe, only a few hundred years old at best. Okay. Apropos, have all of the documents that were copied by Champollion in Turin with such great care survived until the present day? The naive idea about the destruction of inscriptions and documents in general, in order to make his copies the unique source for future generations of researchers, appears easy enough to understand. However, we cannot rule out the possibility that the matter at hand bears no relation to mere vanity, mundane and understandable as it may be, and that Champollion's motivation was a great deal more serious. Yeah, and I agree. I think it probably was. I think they're dead set on that. Our hypothesis is as follows. Apparently, somebody from the host of the first Roman Catholic missionaries of the 18th century, or the Egyptologists of the 19th century, was deliberately destroying the vestiges of the authentic medieval history due to its being drastically at odds with the Scaligerian version, which had already been created in Europe. Fortunately, the destruction wasn't total, and many of the authentic artifacts have survived. Those materials, out of the ones considered dangerous for Scaligerian history, on the monuments of the quote-unquote ancient pharaohs, demonstrate that we are on the right track. As we shall see below, the history of ancient Egypt is really the history of a part of the vast Russian horde, also known as the Mongolian or Ottoman Empire of the 13th through 16th century. Interesting. Okay, so for those of you who are not too familiar with Fomenko, yes, Fomenko is from Russia. Is he making claims like this because he's a Russian nationalist? I don't know, but it's very interesting because when we use the term Russian, especially nowadays, it gets very muddied, right? The Russians, quote unquote, of 300, 400, 500 years ago, they're a completely different people. That whole area is completely different than what we know nowadays, right? You have the whole Tartaria situation going up there as well. And I do believe Fomenko talks about them here or there, but he doesn't really seem to give them too much credit in a lot of this empire building. And maybe that's for a good reason. I don't really have an opinion on Tartaria, but there's definitely something there. I mean, something matters. Anyway, so interesting that Fomenko is claiming that whatever was going on in Egypt during the Middle Ages is based on the Mongolian Empire. Right? And don't forget, the Mongolian Empire, they are not the same Mongols of today. That is a complete fabrication of history. Never forget, the Mongolians of today, they were told of Genghis Khan only like a century ago or something like that. When Europeans came over, European historians, they came over to Mongolia, they told the Mongolians about their own history. The Mongolians had never heard of Genghis Khan. They had no clue. They had no idea that apparently their culture was trying to dominate the world. Right? They had no idea of any of that. And the reason why they didn't have any idea that any of that had happened is because it never happened. The Mongolian Empire, the way we look at it today, is not the real Mongolian Empire. That is a complete fabrication of mainstream and Scaligerian chronology. There's no such thing. So, Fomenko might be right to some degree. Whatever that empire was that was spreading around the Asian, European, North African-ish area, yeah, maybe that was that empire. It's entirely possible, right? And somebody has gone to great lengths to erase this empire. A lot of you guys out there who study Tartaria know this. Like, Tartaria is being erased completely in the modern age. In fact, Tartaria really only started gaining popularity in history recently. Like, it hasn't really been talked about at all for probably like a century or so, or maybe even longer, depending on where you're looking at. Nobody talks about Tartaria. And the reason why is because mainstream history and mainstream historians, for some weird reasons, want nothing to do with it. It's just kind of a weird footnote in history, and we don't need to talk about it. But when you look on ancient maps, you find Tartaria everywhere. I mean, Tartaria was no joke. Okay, I'm like digressing on Tartaria. Anyways, let's finish up this section, and then you guys can go do whatever you want with your life. Such dangerous materials must have instantly been noticed by the first Catholic missionaries, or possibly Jesuits. And I do agree with that. I think the Jesuits probably did a lot of rewriting of history. Well, they did, right? The Scaligerrian chronology, the Petavius portion, Petavius was a Jesuit. So you literally have a Jesuit writing mainstream history, and that's what everybody believes today. So yeah, the Jesuits, they were absolutely involved. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, okay. Such dangerous materials must have instantly been noticed by the first Catholic missionaries or Jesuits, as well as a number of the Western European Egyptologists. They clearly couldn't put up with it, given that in their European homeland, similar memories of the Great Mongolian Conquest of the 14th century and the Mongolian Empire of the 14th through 16th century were already largely from history. Their phantom reflections were fortunate enough to survive simply because they were shifted into deep antiquity owing to the error in the dating of the nativity, and therefore unrecognized. This is why they have escaped destruction. In Egypt, the solution was perfectly easy. Civilized travelers armed themselves with hammers and chisels and started to destroy the priceless evidence of the ancient stones, methodically and ruthlessly casting cautious, thievish civilized travelers armed themselves with hammers and chisels and started to destroy the priceless evidence of the ancient stones, methodically and ruthlessly casting cautious, thievish glances over their shoulders. They may have truly believed that they were improving an erroneous version of history. Still, the scientific community would hardly recognize this as a valid excuse for their actions. One must admit that these travelers managed to achieve their goal, and managed to alter history the way they wanted for a long enough period of time. That ends that section. But, that really does outline one of the issues that nobody in Egyptology ever wants to discuss. I mean, the reality is, and it really doesn't matter what science you're looking into or what history, human corruption is an absolute variable that very few people ever take into account whenever they start getting into a subject. And it makes sense why they don't. Because how many people really want to admit that whatever it is that they are working on is tainted by an ungodly amount of lies and fictitious creations and all of that stuff? And of course, it gets even worse when you start to acknowledge that and then you realize that the very foundation of not only your particular subject, but of your entire society is based on these lies. Because, of course, what that means is that other power structures have gained power from these lies, and those power structures have direct control and influence over how your life goes. So, that causes a problem for a lot of people. And unfortunately, a lot of people would rather turn a blind eye instead of stepping up and making the real change. And I know that's kind of on the extreme side of things. But, when we look at something like history, it's our job to make those changes. That's the point. We are supposed to find the paradigms and shift them. Right? We're supposed to do that, and it doesn't happen. It's simple things that we take for granted. The thing with Champollion. He goes and he deciphers the whole situation there with the Rosetta Stone. But it's funny, there's a whole world of scholarship that looks at that situation and says quite bluntly that that is not a legitimate translation of any of those hieroglyphs. And that conclusion is not based off of schizo stuff. That conclusion is based off of real evidence, real scientific evidence, linguistic evidence, etc. But how often do you ever hear, Even alternative Egyptologists question the Rosetta Stone. You never hear it. And it's funny because the main reason why you don't hear it is because people do not know that they are allowed to question something like that. The Rosetta Stone is now just assumed to have that translation, and that's it. It gets even crazier when we read something like this kind of thing that we just read from Fomenko, when we start to see that other people are accusing somebody like Champollion from going and destroying evidence. No, so regardless of his motivation, right? It could have been anything. It could have been simple egotistical greed. I'm more than happy to say that that's it. Although I wouldn't be surprised if there's something else going on with that guy. It seems a little too convenient that he gets to do some of the stuff that he gets to do. I don't know. Anyway, but I could easily believe that some egotistical guy goes down there, figures stuff out, realizes that he has a cash cow potentially, or at the very least can become famous and can become the major all source of everything, and destroys all other artifacts to make sure that he stays in power. I can very easily see that. And here it is. We have actually people saying that is exactly what he did. So if we have evidence of somebody like Champollion destroying, artifacts from supposed ancient Egypt, what does that mean for all the other stuff that may have been going on? How much did he destroy? Right? How much did Napoleon's armies destroy, perhaps? Right? It gets crazy. So it's really hard to say nowadays, especially, that we know all of this stuff about ancient Egypt. Like, how do you know this? It's impossible. We don't have the evidence anyways to support all the stuff that these guys claim, and we know we have evidence for mass destruction relatively recently, so how are you putting together the kind of chronology that the mainstream is doing with the evidence that it has, or the lack of evidence that it has? So the whole situation is FUBAR. I mean, it's just all messed up. So why am I even talking about this Egyptian situation? One of the reasons why this particular problem is now important, for me personally, is simply because of my work on the zero event thesis. Because right now, if the evidence that we're finding is true, what this is showing is that whoever the hell built the pyramids and all the other megalithic structures, they were not the people who did the hieroglyphs. So two completely different civilizations. What that means then is that the civilization that came after the pyramid builders, whoever the hell they were, I don't know who they were, what dumbed them down? What happened to make them, basically, kind of disappear, but also what made them only exist at a very particular level of intellectual capability? If they were not the pyramid builders, which is fairly obvious at this point now, why did they lose knowledge? What happened? What's going on? Well, the cataclysm could have been the catalyst for that situation. If Mars did indeed show up, and if it did indeed permanently pull the Earth into its current orbit that we have today, and it changed the latitudes of the planet only 1,000 years ago, that would have been the death knell for that area. What that means is that population would have, suffered just from the cataclysm itself. But the repercussions are even worse, because now North Africa is in a latitude that is no longer good for the propagation of life. You can't really live there and be happy, obviously. If we look at Cairo nowadays, there's just the Fertile Crescent, but everything else is kind of a desolate sort of, desert type of area. Without the Nile, you're screwed, basically. So the people who would have been living there, before the zero event, 1,000+ years ago, they would have been generally fine. But after the zero event happens, then of course everything goes to hell, and then that would explain why we find a situation to where a culture goes from having a higher level technology, pyramid building, etc., down to having to use pictographs to kind of live on in their own little civilization. So this is the kind of stuff that I've been digging into, and so this is that evidence. It's right there. Now, to make matters even more interesting, Fomenko is talking about the possibility of that Russian horde, owning North Africa during that period of time. And this is the Russian horde situation gets weird with Fomenko because he may not be wrong. And I don't think he is in a lot of cases, actually. But the terminology that he uses poisons his, gets in the way, because so many people, once they start to hear that Russia did this, they kind of think about Russia in the modern time. But that's not the case. Right? So he needs to stop using the term Russia. I know it's kind of a nationalist thing for him and all that, but if he were to use more of the basic terminology, the real Mongolians, for example, talking about the Tartarians, if he did that, okay, let's read one more section because we still have time, and then I'll let you guys go. This is section 12 of this part of this chapter. It's called The Condition of the Ancient Egyptian Relics. It is believed that the ancient Egyptian priests were doing everything they could in order to protect the buried mummies of the great pharaohs from the ancient looters. It has to be admitted that their alleged care was manifest in a very odd fashion. The first pharaohs were buried with great fanfare, but then the priests would secretly take the mummies out and bury them in a new secret place. This must have happened already in the 17th and 18th century, after the dissolution of the Great Empire, when the Mongolian necropolis was no longer protected by the imperial authorities. The local priests may have waited for the restoration of the empire for some time, but having eventually realized that the process was irreversible, they decided to try and preserve the royal mummies. Oh, you know what? Here's another thing that's interesting. So this great Mongolian empire, whatever this empire was that comes screaming out of the north and kind of, filters all throughout Asia, these guys would have also been a product of whatever the hell happens after the Zero event. Check this out. Think about where these guys are coming from, right? We have this huge horde of invaders, even in the mainstream, that swoops out of North Asia and goes down south to all over the place. Mainstream historians don't really have any good explanation as to why this kind of migration is happening, but I've got one for you. If the Zero event is a real event, if Mars did all of that stuff, then it would make sense that we would have a huge migration of people, whoever was living in the north, swoop down to the south because the north is no longer tenable. Because they can't live up there anymore. Because after the Zero event, the latitudes up there are different. And who knows what kind of destruction they suffered anyways. So this great horde could have been a great empire that was essentially keeping to itself up in North Asia, and then comes sweeping down in order to survive because their old home is no longer tenable. And I have no doubt that that is connected to Tartaria. No doubt at all. I would not be surprised at all if that whole situation is the same damn thing to one degree or another. Anyway, let's go on. At any rate, we are aware of the following, quote, "Thus, for instance, in the epic of the 21st and 22nd dynasty, all the mummies of Seknakra, Yakhmos, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramses II, Ramses III, were concealed in a single place, as well as a number of Amon's priests and several others that remain unidentified. Apart from the mummy of Amenhotep II, his tomb also contained the mummies of Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Menptah, Siptah, Seti II, Ramses IV, Ramses V, Ramses VI, and Queen T, as well as 2 unidentified women and a child. Small side churches were also put to use in order to conceal the treasures, as is the case with the tomb of Amenhotep II, where the researcher Lore discovered and photographed a number of mummies that were simply piled together. One of the prince's mummies even ended up in the ritual sepulchre boat of the tomb's owner. We are unlikely to ever find out about the reasons for such great haste, or the crimes and the persecutions that preceded it. Unquote. Damn, that whole thing was a quote. My bad. Oh, okay, well, damn, that whole thing is a quote. Could it be that all of the events described above did not take place in deep antiquity, as historians are trying to convince us today, but rather the early 19th century, after the invasion of the Napoleonic Army in 1798? The troops of the Egyptian Mamelukes were put to complete rout. This was followed by a bloody massacre. The Mamelukes were simply slaughtered en masse. That's a good point to actually bring up in relation to changing chronology because, okay, so the claim right now is that whoever did the Egyptian hieroglyphics, that was medieval Egypt essentially. So whoever was there did all of that stuff. And of course, we have all the horoscopes that prove those dates. So this is not a guess. There's a lot of science there that goes into proving that this is what happened. So it's already a little weird then, right? Because what that does is that says that people were still carving hieroglyphs when Napoleon's army shows up. So it's like you have two completely different historical time periods, which are basically the same period. And this is going to be one of the things that a lot of people are going to have a hard time digesting, because nobody really thinks about ancient Egypt and Napoleonic soldiers coexisting, together in any form, shape, or another, right? So anyways, just throwing that out there, just trying to quantify that because it gets weird, but that's the claim. Now, of course, by the time Napoleon's army shows up, there couldn't have been much going on, because by that point in time, everything was pretty much drying out and dead. It probably would have only been stragglers hanging out in the area. You would not have had this grand, huge, medieval empire sitting down there. That's not what Napoleon's army would have run into. Whatever was left of what they're calling the Mamelukes, that was not some grand army. Let's put it like that. They were not, floating around in cars or UFOs or whatever and doing teleportation. These guys were just stragglers who had banded together to live in that area. And to be blunt, it seems like their area was essentially dying out. So it probably was not a pain in the butt for Napoleon's army to just wipe out whoever the hell was in the way, because there really wasn't all that much left. Yeah, okay, anyway. Most likely, the last Mamelukes and their priest were desperately trying to save at least some part of their halidams from the invaders, hastily hiding mummies, treasures, and so on. When the European victors and their allies drowned Egypt in blood, they obviously tried to eschew all responsibility for the destruction and the defacement of many monuments, and point the blame at the, quote, ancient pharaohs and ancient looters and the ancient Hyksos dynasties and so on, unquote. The usual wartime logic. Yeah, that's interesting. So, there is a group of thought even in the mainstream that says that Napoleon's army came down there and did a lot of destroying. I don't know if I buy that. I don't know if Napoleon's army... I have a feeling that Napoleon's army is probably taking the blame for a completely different group's actions. Because, Napoleon goes down there with archaeologists. He doesn't seem to be hell-bent on destroying anything. He actually seems to be going out of his way to catalog what he finds. So it would be a little weird if his army shows up and just starts completely defacing everything. I'm not saying that they didn't do anything. That's not what I'm saying. But it's a little weird to think that his army shows up and just starts mass destroying everything. I don't buy that. I don't think the evidence really supports that either. All right. At the same time, we are told stories about Napoleon's respect for the holy places. Oh, okay, here we go. His army was accompanied by a large number of scientists, artists, and writers. Napoleon himself claimed that he had invaded Egypt in order to help it move towards the light. He had founded a number of special scientific institutions and gave orders to draw all the constructions and the ruins of the monuments. Napoleon performed a great work in Egypt. Yeah, see? That's what it seems like to me. Right? It doesn't seem that he went down there to destroy. So, my guess is there's another part of history that we're just not seeing yet. Which makes sense, because obviously if medieval Egypt has, people doing the hieroglyphs that we now ascribe to ancient Egypt, that's not commonly known at all, but that shows that there are huge aspects of history that we are not even close to understanding. So it's entirely possible something else was also taking place. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the mystery schools had something to do with it. It wouldn't surprise me at all. An orifice was drilled in the Sphinx in order to find the passageways mentioned in the antiquity. In Dendera, he did what no other invader known in the entire history of humankind has ever done, leaving a precise copy of a large stone with the zodiac as a replacement of the original, which was taken away to Paris. Yeah, that's weird, huh? Yeah, the Dendera Zodiac, that's a pretty famous one. I didn't realize he made the copy. Huh. He ordered to open direct cannon fire in order to deface the ancient Sphinx. The results can be seen in the figures below. I see, and I don't know if he did that, man. Do we really have proof that he ordered the Sphinx to be? I don't know about that one. That's one of those historic legends that I don't know. K. Karam obviously tries to mitigate the impression that the readers might get as he reports these barbarities committed by Napoleon's soldiers. Quote, "One of the sphinxes lie there, half human, half beast, with the remains of a leonine mane and holes in place of the eyes and the nose. Napoleon's soldiers had once used this head as a target for their cannons. This beast was resting for many thousands of years," unquote, as Karam assures us. So I guess Karam must be hating on Napoleon's army. So he's just quoting this author. Okay, anyway, quote, "And is prepared to lay there for many more millennia to come. It is so enormous that one of Tutmosis could have built a temple between its paws," unquote. Well, that's kind of a different Sphinx then, huh? Because there's no Sphinx with that size. The Sphinx that we know right now is not a huge Sphinx. You're not building a temple between those paws, huh? Will it be bold to hypothesize that the French artillerists were also playing their part in the rectification of history at the request of one of the Egyptologists, destroying the symbols that did not fit into the veracious Scaligerine history of Egypt, such as a Christian cross on the head of the Sphinx, for instance? Wow, really? Huh. We have already mentioned that the shape of the Uraeus snakes, as seen on the headdress of the two ancient Egyptian sphinxes that were taken away from Egypt to St. Petersburg in the 18th century and can be seen on the left bank of the Neva, roughly opposite the Hermitage, is indeed very similar to the Christian cross. Yeah, the Uraeus, I don't know about that. Also, the Uraeus looks just like the Christian cross on the ancient Egyptian statues that can be seen in the figures. It might be that this semblance was too obvious in case of the great Sphinx's head. So he's making the claim that there might have been some kind of a cross on one of the Sphinx's head. And of course, if you're going to claim that the Sphinx was built like 5,000 years ago, you can't have a Christian cross. Right? It's not going to work. Is he right? I don't know. That's a weird one. Here, let's finish this up and then we'll talk some crap. Nowadays, quote, "The large cracks and indentations, especially on the Sphinx, the face of the Sphinx, are filled with cement. However, Even after this restoration, the face of the Sphinx remains hopelessly mutilated. Indeed, Napoleon performed a great work in Egypt, emphasizing that the country needed assistance in order to move towards the light. Unquote. I guess. So some of this, I don't know. All right, we'll wrap this up. We're getting close to time anyway. I don't actually disagree that there may have actually been, or the people who are doing all the hieroglyphs may have been Christians in their religion. Now that might sound crazy, but we have a weird problem after the zero event catastrophe takes place. Because once that zero event takes place and everybody's kind of screwed up again and the planet gets thrown around, this is when Christianity seems to appear out of nowhere. And for me, this is a huge question, because where the hell did it come from? Like, where did all of these teachings suddenly start to spread everywhere? Where did certain aspects of this iconography suddenly decide to pop up only after this particular event? These are all legitimate questions. Is it possible that the Egyptians who were living in the Middle Ages in ancient Egypt, in the ruins of Egypt, were they already Christians? And were they doing all kinds of Christian stuff? For example, when you look at the Ankh, the Ankh is something that, we all think is Egyptian, but that's essentially a cross. I mean, they even have straight up Christian crosses all over the place in the hieroglyphics. Right? Those are downplayed, obviously, because you can't erase all of them, but they're there. And in fact, once again, Egypt is one of those places that has the same story of Christ. Now, I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in God or anything, but the stories are there. Why do the supposed ancient Egyptians have an analogous story with respect to, the Christianity situation? These are legitimate questions. For me, what this stuff is starting to say is it's starting to show that something else completely went down after the zero event catastrophe. And I don't get what it is. Like, I don't have answers. But these are the problems. So is it possible, maybe, that somebody like Napoleon was maybe a member of a group as well, goes down there and takes care of some business? Because one of the things that happens to Christianity, so far as I can tell, Christianity seems to come out with really good intentions, and it spreads everywhere. And I don't know how that happens. That's weird too. Right? We don't need God or anything to do that. It could have been people doing their thing. Whatever. But what's interesting is there seems to be other groups that really despise what is going on. And ultimately, what those groups have done is they were able to corrupt and then co-opt that religion, and they now use that religion as a method of control, in the government, all over this planet, countries, etc. Islam is part of this. Islam is one of those religions that is also under that umbrella of control that was corrupted from whatever the original was. Islam gets different because Islam might be completely artificial, and I'm not going to get into any of that right now. But these are the questions that this brings up. Is this iconography being destroyed? This Middle Ages Egyptian iconography being destroyed so that the Scaligerrian history can remain as the status quo, so that your average person has no idea what was actually going on in the recent past? And it's my contention that is exactly what is happening. And Fomenko touches on some of this here. Now, I don't know if I agree with everything Fomenko says. We're still studying. We still got to learn. But the perspective is interesting. Our pasts, our histories, they are nothing like what the mainstream tells us. Not even close.